Hi, Lena. It's great to be with you again.
Well, one of your recent articles titled Trump wants $500 billion more for the Pentagon as deficits mount is something that I would really love to discuss and explore deeper today. Trump calls for a record $1.5 trillion defense budget, and this is a 50% increase over the Pentagon's current budget. The Pentagon has never passed an audit before, and many people don't know this. And in fact, it not only didn't pass an audit, it failed an audit 8 consecutive years in a row. And as a former auditor, I have to say that passing an audit is not an extraordinary achievement. It's really not. It's a very basic, reasonable requirement that ensures accountability and a level of transparency. And so, yet here we are preparing to give $1.5 trillion to a government agency that has never passed an audit, that failed to produce documentation to prove its expenses and its assets. In your article, you wrote that the proposed spending increase reflects how much the Trump administration has become focused on pushing new wars and how much the White House actually loves to spend taxpayer money. Could you elaborate on how increasing military spending is directly tied to interventionist U.S. foreign policy, as you mentioned in your article, and it's all done at the expense of U.S. taxpayers?
Yeah, I think it's really just part of a larger policy agenda, which is just spending in general. It's not just defense spending. This is not an administration that is committed to cutting any other form of spending except some trimming around the edges, right? USAID took some cuts. And you hear about, oh, we're going to cut off grants to Harvard if they don't get rid of their DEI programs and things like this. But these are all just tiny drops in the bucket of overall federal spending. What drives federal spending are the big, huge programs: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense spending. And all those together make up the overwhelming majority of federal spending. So you can never ignore defense spending if you want to talk about what's going on at the federal level in terms of spending. And this is not an administration where it's like, oh, well, we'll cut Social Security spending, and that would be political suicide. He never talks about cutting Social Security or Medicare or anything for older voters. Nobody wants to do that in Washington because that would cost you votes. So he's not talking about cutting anything like that in order to put more money into defense. It's just all extra. It's just more spending overall is just the overall plan. So, Social Security is about, oh, I don't know, 1.4 trillion. And if we're looking at defense, it's getting close to that as well. And what was so remarkable about his tweet, that's now how he makes policy pronouncements,
Yes.
is by tweet, right? So he puts out a tweet in mid January and he says, the world's a dangerous place, so we need another $500 billion in defense spending. So that's on top of the current $1 trillion or so, and that's a 50% increase over what was the last years of total, which really we need to make sure if we're getting a really accurate account of defense spending, we have to include VA. We have to include veterans type spending. And a lot of people get annoyed when you do this, but you have to because VA spending is really just deferred spending on defense, right?
Mhm.
What is VA spending? It is a government program. These are programs that were used to recruit people to sign up for the military and join the military, and you'll get these benefits. And then, of course, if you get injured, then you can get VA healthcare benefits, which, by the way, are notoriously bad, right? This is
Mhm.
socialized healthcare at work in the U.S. government, and but there are a lot of people on VA benefits, so those have to be included. They came up with a political scheme where they're like, oh, we'll break that off from defense spending, and then it'll look like it's something else, and we claim defense spending is smaller than it is. So in reality, if you include VA defense spending, it's closer to about 1.3 trillion already. And so Trump's saying, let's add another half trillion to that 500 billion. And if you chart it out in a graph, it looks like comical because
Mhm.
what you've got is this upward sloping curve. Even in inflation adjusted terms, it's going up and has been going up for years. But to add 500 billion to that, it's just like literally off the charts. It just jumps up so far. It's really quite remarkable. Now, of course, we all know how Trump works, and so a lot of supporters will say, "Well, he's just trying to negotiate maybe another 200 billion." That would still be off the charts to have it go from 1 trillion to 1.2 trillion just in Pentagon spending, plus then VA spending. So that's what we're talking about. These are huge numbers and also bigger than Cold War numbers. This is something that we have to keep in mind. This is not going back to anything lower than was occurring in the 80s during Reagan's big defense buildup. If we adjust for inflation, there's a lot more spending going on now on the military than was going on even in the 80s when we were told the United States needed to fight the evil empire and there was a missile gap and the US still might lose and the Soviets might win. They still were spending less than they're spending now to confront countries that have in no way sworn eternal enmity toward the US, like, say, the Soviets were doing in the 1960s. So that's just like a totally different reality. Nonetheless, the spending is higher than ever. And as you noted, of course, they don't even know where that money goes once they spend it because no audit has been passed. They announced that, oh, this time we're going to get our act together and we're going to pass the audit. Their new target year for passing an audit is 2028. They're not even promising to do anything this year or next year. That's going to require another at least 24 months to figure out how to pass that audit. So obviously nobody should believe that or take that seriously. So that's just kind of the reality now where we are with federal spending. It's just very, very large. And we should know, by the way, that these increases are Biden level sorts of increases in overall spending. So a lot of Republican types who don't like Biden, they're saying, oh, right, he had runaway spending in the final year of his administration, which was by far the largest year for spending after COVID. So imagine what has federal spending looked like in the last few years? Well, first of all, in the last year of Trump, it was gigantic, right? Huge $2 trillion deficits because he was just spending everything he could on COVID relief. And in those days, the idea was just spend, 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 print up $6 trillion, and we'll deal with the inflation later. We're back to that now. If you look at federal spending and you even adjust for inflation, this is the second worst year ever in terms of it's the fiscal year and what's federal spending look like. It's the second worst ever, and it's also the third worst ever in terms of deficits so far this fiscal year. So we're on track to end the fiscal year with a deficit of probably at least 1.6, 1.7 trillion dollars, which is huge. You would have to go back to basically the COVID year to find those sorts of deficits. And if the insane spending of the COVID year is your baseline now, well, we're in deep, deep trouble. So this is not a reversion to the mean by any means. Now that you've got Trump in there, he is continuing Biden era and COVID era sorts of spending, and the military spending is just a part of that.
Trump said that it's easy and he used that word, he says, we can easily get to $1.5 trillion. Now, where will the Trump administration get this extra $500 billion? As you point out in your article, the federal government continues to increase spending faster than tax and tariff revenues come in.
Yes, they continue to push this obvious lie that tariff revenues are going to be sufficient to cover something like a $500 billion increase. Nonsense. We've been looking at over the whole time that they've been collecting tariffs. It continues to be about, say, 5% of total federal revenues. It's overwhelmingly based on the income tax. So you can forget about Trump saying anything about getting rid of the IRS and the income tax. That's not going to happen because the way that they're spending money, unless he's cutting programs 50, 60, 70%, there's no way to get rid of the income tax unless you're going to fund all of that with just printed money and runaway price inflation all the time. So the income tax isn't going anywhere. And this idea that we can just rely on tariffs to pay for this just is unrealistic because this is always going to be, even if it starts to really take off, we're talking about revenues are going to be under 10% of total federal tax revenues. And on top of that, you're still going to be running nearly $2 trillion deficits, $1.5 trillion deficits anyway. So where's this $500 billion going to come from? It's not going to come from tariffs. Some of it could, right? A little small bit of it could, but most of it's just going to come from inflationary deficit spending. And that's just what we're going to be stuck with. We're just going to be stuck with a bunch more debt, which will eventually probably turn into higher interest rates and more inflation over time as well.
There are many people who think that federal deficits don't matter, and there are many economists who argue that they don't matter. Well, your article argues that Americans are paying a lot for these deficits. Can you explain to us how that works?
Yes, and I can understand why most people, especially most people who have been adults for a while and watching the news for a while, we've all heard for decades, right? Oh, big federal deficits, that's a bad thing. We should worry about it. But then whatever happens, what's the problem with federal deficits? Doesn't seem to be a problem. Part of the reason that people have concluded it's not a problem is because interest rates have been going down for the last 40 years. And they went up very high in the early 1980s when the then Fed chairman, he was trying to really bring inflation under control. And so you had interest rates hit high levels then. But ever since then, they've been coming down significantly. So during the Greenspan era, falling interest rates. During Bernanke and Yellen, falling interest rates. And a lot of that was really to add stimulus to the economy. But also the effect of that is the other main reason that the Fed exists. The Fed exists partly to stimulate the economy. But the number one reason the Fed exists is to make sure that the US government can always borrow easily and always have access to easy funds. And that's why all central banks exist. That's why Napoleon founded the Bank of France, or at least turned it into its current version, which was, hey, I need money for war. Let's make sure there's a bank out there that will always lend me money at affordable interest rates. So that situation has changed, though. Sure, when you have perpetually falling interest rates over multitude of decades, it's going to seem like deficits don't matter because you can just take on more and more debt and you don't have to worry about interest payments, really. Just imagine if you had a home mortgage and you could just refinance every few years and the interest rate just kept getting lower, which is actually what a lot of people did for much of that time period. So now that interest rates are heading up, we're starting to see the effects of that because interest rates have only gone up a little bit in terms of overall averages, in terms of treasuries for the federal government. But the amount of money now that the federal government has to pay on its interest, on its huge debt, which is currently 38.7 trillion, I think, is becoming substantially larger and at a rapid rate. So if you just want to see where deficit spending is starting to really cost people money, is just look at how much of the federal outlays, that is overall federal spending, has to go to paying interest on the debt. And it is really headed upward so that now last year paid about, I think, 1.8 trillion total. No, it was over 1 trillion on federal deficits alone. So that's $1 trillion out of what is probably, in terms of tax revenue, 1 trillion out of about 5 trillion, just using really rough numbers. That is a substantial portion of overall federal spending that is going to do nothing but pay interest on the debt. You're just paying interest on old lost wars, on old welfare programs for people long dead, on stuff that younger workers never approved of, never were asked about, never signed off of, and they're now paying trillions of dollars. In fact, in recent months, for the last 6 months or so, 20% or more, sometimes 24, almost 25% of each month's federal spending goes to just interest on the debt. So these are huge numbers, and they're just going to keep accumulating as the federal debt gets higher because there's no reason to believe that overall treasuries are going to go down significantly. So if you're wondering, hey, I'm paying all these taxes, how come I don't seem to be getting much for it? It's because more than a quarter of every dollar you pay in taxes is just going to interest on the debt, which doesn't benefit you in any way. So that's a big portion of it. Also, other factors is this drives up interest rates for you just as a normal person in the world. And why? Because in order to finance its huge debt, the government has to borrow more and more money. As it borrows more and more money, and it floods the marketplace with treasuries, with federal debt, well, then people who invest in these bonds, in these treasuries, are going to see that they're becoming less and less valuable as more and more of them pile up. And they're going to say, hey, we don't want to pay as much for this debt now that it's everywhere. So that means that yields have to go up because they want to pay lower prices for their bonds because they're everywhere. They're worth less. That means that yields, interest rates paid, will have to go up. So it's driving up interest rates in general in the economy because treasuries are such a big part of the interest rate economy that you're going to see rising interest rates as well. And you can see that. I think that's already being seen in how it affects even 30-year mortgage rates. Now, it's not the only thing affecting 30-year mortgage rates. Expectations of inflation, which are related to what we're talking about, are a problem there. But also, as you expect more and more debt to flood into the economy, interest rates will go up. And ever since the Fed started cutting interest rates in September of 2024, 30-year interest rates actually went up a little bit. And then in recent months, there are all these calls, oh, bring 30-year mortgage rates back down. Fed, as the Fed doesn't really set mortgage rates, but it can try to affect them. So the Fed lowered its target interest rate again. And ever since then, in recent months, the 30-year mortgage rate has ticked up slightly again, as has the 10-year yield to which mortgage rates are tied closely. And that's just because of all these rising mountains of debt and deficit spending. Is there a lot of that sensitivity to trying to get interest rates back down has been severed, it's been destroyed, and now there's upward pressure in interest rates. So yeah, how do deficits affect me? Well, you're probably paying more in interest on your debt now. Well, more of the tax dollars you pay goes to just pay off old worthless debts that the government accumulated years ago. And that's affecting people, and that's going to get even worse as the debt gets larger and if interest rates don't go back down significantly.